when the plane shook violently through the night storm, cabin lights flickering and children crying out. A single father stood up. He said calmly, "I can land this plane." The CEO laughed with contempt. But then the cockpit door opened. The pilot looked at him stunned, stood at attention, and raised his hand in salute. In that moment, every prejudice in the cabin collapsed, and the fate of the flight changed forever from this second on. The late-night flight had been delayed twice already. Outside the small oval windows, darkness pressed thick against the glass, interrupted only by occasional flashes of distant lightning. The cabin felt heavy with exhaustion and irritation. Passengers slumped in their seats, faces illuminated by the blue glow of phones and tablets. Everyone just wanted this over with. Carter Hayes sat in 23C. His daughter Bonnie tucked against the window beside him. His jacket was worn at the elbows, the fabric faded from too many washes. His backpack, wedged under the seat in front, showed scuff marks along the bottom. He looked like a man who counted his dollars, who clipped coupons, who drove an old sedan that needed one more year. His hands moved constantly, checking Bonnie's seatbelt, adjusting her blanket, making sure her water bottle was secure in the seat pocket. Bonnie was 7, maybe 8. Her hair fell in tangled waves around her face. She clutched a paper airplane she'd folded herself, the creases sharp and precise. Carter had shown her how to make the wings just right, how to balance the weight. She kept smoothing the folds with her small fingers, whispering to herself about where it would fly. 3 rows ahead. Alexandra Reed sat in first class, her leather briefcase open on the tray table. She was 34, sharp-featured, with hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her whole face into a permanent expression of control. Her suit probably cost more than Carter's monthly rent. She traveled with 2 people, Clinton, her assistant, a man in his late 20s who nodded at everything she said, and Amanda, a corporate lawyer whose job was to make sure every contract bled in Alexandra's favor. They were flying to close a deal, a big one, the kind that got written up in business journals, the kind that made stock prices jump. Alexandra had spent the entire boarding process on her phone, her voice cutting through the cabin as she issued orders to people on the other end who scrambled to obey. The delay had put her in a foul mood. Her seat wasn't quite right. The angle was wrong. The attendant had brought sparkling water when she'd asked for still. Small irritations that most people would shrug off felt like personal insults to someone who spent her life bending the world to her will. When Bonnie had walked past her row during boarding, trailing her father, Alexandra had glanced up with the kind of look wealthy people give to inconvenient things, the look that says, "Why is this in my space?" The flight attendants had finally closed the doors. The captain's voice came over the intercom, apologizing for the delay, explaining they'd have to route around some weather. His tone was professional, calm, the kind of voice that's supposed to make you feel safe. But Carter had listened to the pitch of the engines as they spooled up. He'd watched the wings flex slightly during takeoff. His eyes tracked every small variation, every subtle change in sound and vibration that most passengers never noticed. 20 minutes into the flight, Bonnie's water bottle slipped from her grip. It bounced once, then rolled forward, coming to rest against the foot of the passenger in front of her. That passenger picked it up, turned, smiled, and handed it back. A small moment of human kindness. But 5 minutes later, Bonnie fumbled with her snack bag, pretzels scattered across the aisle. Some skittered forward, all the way to row 20, Ocone. One landed on Alexandra's shoe. Carter was out of his seat immediately, crouching in the aisle, gathering pretzels with quick, efficient movements. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "She's tired. Long day." Alexandra lifted her foot with exaggerated distaste. "You should control your child," she said. Her voice carried. Other passengers glanced over. Carter's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He just kept collecting pretzels, dropping them into his palm. Bonnie's face had gone red, tears pooling in her eyes. Clinton leaned toward Alexandra. "Some people just don't know how to travel," he murmured, loud enough for Carter to hear. "Flying used to mean something. Now it's like riding a bus." Amanda said nothing, but her expression showed agreement. The look that says, "We're better than this. We shouldn't have to share space with people like them." Carter returned to his seat. He put his arm around Bonnie, whispered something in her ear. She wiped her eyes and nodded. He pulled out a piece of paper from his backpack and helped her fold another airplane, his fingers guiding hers through each crease. The motion seemed to calm her. But something else happened in that moment. Carter's eyes had caught the airline logo on the seatback in front of him. He'd stared at it for just a beat too long, like seeing an old photograph that brings back a flood of memories you've spent years trying to bury. In his wallet, tucked behind his driver's license, there was an ID card. Old, laminated, the edges worn soft. He'd pulled it out once, months ago. When Bonnie had asked about his job, he'd looked at it, then put it away without showing her. She'd seen the motion. Though, kids notice everything. "What's that, Daddy-a?" she'd asked. "Nothing important," he'd said. "Just old stuff." The turbulence started 30 minutes later. At first it was gentle, just a bump here and there. The seatbelt sign came on with a soft chime. Flight attendants began moving through the cabin, checking that everyone was buckled in. But then the plane dropped. Not a lot. Maybe 10 feet. But enough that people gasped. Enough that drinks jumped in their cups. The cabin lights flickered once, twice. The lead flight attendant, Adelaide, a woman in her 50s with the kind of calm that comes from 20 years of handling nervous passengers, made her way to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the seatbelt sign. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We're experiencing some rough air, but this is completely normal. We should be through it shortly." Her voice was steady, professional. But Carter noticed she gripped the seats as she walked back to her jump seat. Noticed the way her eyes kept darting toward the cockpit door. Noticed how she exchanged a glance with another attendant that lasted just a fraction too long. The plane shook again, harder this time. A woman near the front let out a small scream. A man's laptop slid off his tray table and clattered to the floor. Carter's hand moved to Bonnie's seatbelt, checking it was tight. Then he leaned close to her ear. "Hey, remember what we practiced when you get scared?" She nodded, her face pale. "Count to 4 while you breathe in. Hold for 4, out for 4. Can you do that with me?" She nodded again. They breathed together, his hand steady on her shoulder. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. His voice low and calm, like this was just another game they played. A businessman across the aisle noticed, watched Carter teach his daughter to manage fear with the precision of someone who'd done this before, in situations far worse than turbulence. The businessman's own hands were shaking. He found himself counting along, matching Carter's rhythm. Another jolt. This one made the overhead bins rattle. The lights went out completely for 3 seconds. When they came back on, they were dimmer, flickering. The entertainment screens went black. Adelaide received a message on her phone. Her face changed. Just slightly. Just enough that anyone watching closely would see the shift from routine procedure to this is actually serious. She stood, moving toward the cockpit with quick, purposeful steps. Another attendant followed her. They disappeared through the door. In the cabin, panic was starting to bloom. A woman was crying. A man was praying out loud in Spanish. Someone else was demanding to know what was happening, their voice rising with each word. Alexandra's knuckles were white where she gripped the armrests. She'd put down her phone. For the first time in hours, she wasn't in control of anything. Clinton beside her had gone quiet, his earlier smugness replaced by the wide-eyed look of someone realizing that money doesn't matter when you're 6 miles up in a metal tube that's shaking itself apart. The plane tilted. Not much. Maybe 15 degrees. But enough that the angle felt wrong. Enough that the engine noise changed pitch, got rougher, less synchronized. Carter's eyes went to the wing outside his window. He watched the flaps, the way they were positioned, watched the angle of attack. His lips moved silently, calculating, processing. This wasn't just fear. This was analysis, the kind that comes from training, from experience. Bonnie gripped his arm. "Daddy, I'm right here, sweetheart. Keep breathing, just like we practiced. You're doing great." The cockpit door opened. Adelaide came out, followed by a man in plain clothes, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of alert posture that said security or law enforcement, an air marshal named Zane. Adelaide moved to the intercom. This time. Her voice was different, still professional, but with an edge of urgency that made everyone stop talking and listen. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a technical situation. The captain has requested that if there is anyone on board with flight experience or aviation training, please identify yourself to a crew member immediately." Silence. Complete. Absolute silence. Then the whispers started. Technical situation. Flight experience. Why would they need that? Why would the captain ask for help? The plane shook again, the hardest yet. Overhead bins popped open. Bags tumbled out. Someone screamed. And Carter Hayes stood up. He didn't rush, didn't shout. He just unbuckled his seatbelt, straightened, and raised his hand. His voice cut through the chaos. Calm and clear. "I can help. I can land this plane." Every head in the cabin turned. Alexandra Reed stared at him, at this man in the worn jacket. This man who couldn't control his daughter's snack bag. This man who looked like he worked construction or drove a delivery truck. And she laughed. Not a big laugh, just a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "You," she said. Her voice carried across the cabin. "You think this is a movie? You think you can just walk into a cockpit and save the day?" Clinton joined in. "This is insane. Sit down. You're going to make things worse." Other passengers murmured, some in agreement with Alexandra, some in desperate hope, some just confused, trying to understand what was happening. Carter's eyes met Alexandra's. He didn't look angry, just tired, like he'd heard this kind of contempt before, and learned long ago that arguing was pointless. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm not trying to be a hero, but if they're asking for help, that means they need it, and I have the training." "Training?" Alexandra's voice dripped with mockery. "What training? You fold paper airplanes with your kid. You watch aviation documentaries." Carter looked down at Bonnie. She was gripping his hand, her eyes huge and frightened. He'd built his whole life around keeping her safe, around staying invisible, staying out of the spotlight, avoiding questions about who he used to be. If he stepped forward now, everything would come out. His past, his former life, the reasons he'd walked away. There would be investigations, media, people asking questions he didn't want to answer, questions that would follow Bonnie to school, that would mark her as different, as the girl whose dad had secrets. But if he didn't step forward, if he let fear keep him in his seat, everyone on this plane might die, including his daughter. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Please watch Bonnie," he said to the businessman across the aisle. The man nodded, reaching out to put a hand on the girl's shoulder. Carter moved toward the front of the cabin. Adelaide met him halfway, with Zane right behind her. "You have documentation?" Zane asked. His voice was hard, suspicious. "In an emergency, people lie. People panic and exaggerate and claim expertise they don't have." Carter pulled out his wallet, slid out the old ID card, handed it over. Zane looked at it. His eyebrows went up. He glanced at Adelaide, then back at Carter. "This is current. The experience is," Carter said. "The job isn't. I left that life years ago." "Why?" Carter's jaw worked. "Personal reasons." Zane studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded and handed back the ID. "Come with me." They moved toward the cockpit door. Behind them, Alexandra was half standing, craning to see. "This is insane," she said again. "You can't just let some random passenger into the cockpit. There are protocols. There are rules." Adelaide turned to face her. "Ma'am, in an emergency, the captain has the authority to make these decisions. Please sit down and let us do our jobs." The cockpit door opened. Inside, the scene was controlled chaos. The captain, Henry, a man in his late 50s with silver hair, was slumped in his seat. Conscious but clearly unwell, sweat beaded on his forehead. His breathing was shallow, rapid. The co-pilot, Finn, a younger man maybe in his early 30s, had both hands on the controls, his face locked in concentration. Screens flashed warnings. Alarms beeped in overlapping rhythms. The autopilot disconnect warning was the loudest, a steady tone that meant the plane was being flown manually in conditions that would challenge even a fully healthy crew. Finn glanced back as Carter entered. "Who are you?" "Someone who can read a checklist and follow orders," Carter said. "I'm here to assist, not take over. You're still in command, but you need a second set of hands." Finn's eyes were desperate. "You know what you're doing." "I do." "Prove it." Carter moved to the empty jump seat behind the captain's chair. He didn't touch anything, just looked at the instrument panel. "You've got dual hydraulic warnings. That's why the autopilot disengaged. You're hand-flying in IMC conditions with asymmetric engine response." He pointed to a gauge. "Oh, that's your number 2 engine running rough. You're compensating with rudder trim, but you're fighting it. You need to reduce power on number 2 and increase on number 1 to balance the thrust." Finn stared at him. How did you— I've flown this model, Carter said simply. Different circumstances, same systems. What do you need me to do, Henry? The captain stirred. His eyes focused with effort on Carter's face. His mouth opened, closed. He was trying to place the features, the voice, something familiar, something from long ago. Recognition hit like lightning. Hayes. Henry's voice was weak, confused. Carter Hayes. Carter froze. Finn looked between them. You know each other. Henry was struggling to sit up straighter. His eyes were clearer now, the shock of recognition cutting through whatever medical issue had laid him low. You trained me, he said. His voice was getting stronger. 1998. Advanced Combat Flight School. You were the instructor who pulled me through when I was about to wash out. Carter closed his eyes briefly. Captain, we need to focus on— But Henry wasn't listening. He was pushing himself up, trying to stand. His body wouldn't cooperate fully, but he managed to get upright, swaying. And then, despite everything, despite the alarms and the turbulence and the emergency unfolding around them, Henry straightened to attention as much as his weakened state allowed, and saluted. A full, formal military salute, hand to forehead, elbow at 90 degrees, eyes locked on Carter's face. Finn's jaw dropped. Zane, still standing in the doorway, went completely still. Sir, Henry said, his voice carrying the weight of 25 years of respect and gratitude. I never forgot what you did for me. You saved my career. You saved my life, in a way. I owe you everything I've become. Carter's face had gone pale. This was exactly what he'd been avoiding for years. The recognition, the past coming back, the reminder of who he used to be. But there was no time for this. No time for reunions or explanations. Captain, Carter said firmly, sit down before you fall down. Finn, keep your hands on the controls. We have work to do. Henry sank back into his seat, but he was looking at Carter with an expression that was part awe, part relief, part vindication, like seeing a ghost of someone he'd thought was lost to the world. Adelaide, watching from the doorway, felt her whole body relax a fraction. If the captain trusted this man enough to salute him, then this might actually work. She turned and went back into the cabin. Faces looked up at her, desperate for news. We have an additional qualified pilot assisting in the cockpit, she announced. Please remain calm and seated. We're going to get through this. Alexandra Reed sat frozen in her seat. The man she'd mocked. The man she'd treated like an annoyance. The pilot had just saluted him. That didn't happen for paper airplane folders. That didn't happen for pretenders. Clinton beside her had gone very quiet. The smug superiority had drained from his face, replaced by something like fear, not of the emergency, of being wrong, of having revealed himself as the kind of person who judges others based on nothing but appearances and assumptions. In the cockpit, Carter had taken the jump seat and pulled out the emergency checklist. Finn, talk to me. What happened to the captain? Blood pressure dropped suddenly, Finn said, his voice tight with stress. We think it's his medication reacting to the altitude change and stress. He's conscious but can't fly. And the hydraulic failures? We hit severe turbulence. Something ruptured. We've got backup systems, but they're not responding normally. Carter studied the gauges. We're not going to make the original destination. What's the closest airport with a long enough runway? And emergency services. Finn rattled off the code. Carter nodded and reached for the radio. I'll coordinate with ATC. You keep us stable. Captain, I need you to monitor Finn's vitals. If he starts to fade, you tell me immediately. Henry nodded, even weakened, even struggling. He was still a pilot, still part of the team. The next 40 minutes were a study in controlled precision. Carter didn't take the controls. That would have violated protocol and probably made things worse. Instead, he became Finn's second brain, reading callouts, calculating approach vectors, communicating with air traffic control in the clipped, professional language of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The plane shook, alarms continued to sound, but gradually. Through the teamwork of 3 men, the aircraft stabilized. The descent began, controlled, measured. In the cabin, Bonnie sat with her hands clasped in her lap, the businessman beside her murmuring encouragement. She was doing the breathing exercise her father had taught her. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. She'd learned it wasn't just for turbulence. It was for any time the world felt too big and scary. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thunk that resonated through the airframe. The plane dropped lower. Through the windows, passengers could see lights. An airport. Runways lined with emergency vehicles, their lights flashing red and blue in the darkness. Finn's hands were locked on the controls, his forearms trembling with effort. The crosswind was brutal, trying to push them off the approach path. Carter's voice was steady in his ear. You've got this. Small corrections. Trust your instruments. Airspeed is good. Glide slope is good. Just a little right rudder. That's it. Perfect. The runway rose up to meet them. The plane shuddered. One wheel touched, then the other. A bounce. A second touch. Then all the wheels were down, and the reverse thrusters engaged with a roar. They were down. Safe. The cabin erupted in sound. Crying, cheering, praying, people hugging strangers. The kind of raw emotional release that happens when you've been holding your breath without realizing it, and suddenly you can breathe again. Finn sat back in his seat, hands shaking so badly he had to clasp them together. We did it, he whispered. We actually did it. Henry reached over and gripped Carter's shoulder. Thank you, he said, for everything, then and now. Carter just nodded. He was already thinking about what came next. The questions, the reports, the attention. Emergency vehicles surrounded the plane as it taxied to a stop. Paramedics boarded immediately, checking on Henry first, then moving through the cabin to assess other passengers. News crews were already setting up outside, their cameras pointing at the plane like hungry predators. Carter made his way back to Bonnie. She launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his waist and burying her face in his jacket. He held her tight, one hand on the back of her head, and closed his eyes. You did good, sweetheart, he murmured. You were so brave. I knew you'd fix it, she whispered into his jacket. I knew you could. People were looking at him now, not with contempt, with gratitude, with curiosity, with the kind of attention he'd spent years avoiding. Alexandra Reed sat in her seat, not moving. The other passengers were filing out, but she couldn't seem to stand. She was watching Carter with his daughter, seeing the gentleness in how he held her, the care in how he checked her over for any signs of distress. Clinton touched her arm. We should go, The car service will be waiting. We can spin this for the media. Say we kept everyone calm, provided leadership. Alexandra turned to look at him. Really look at him. You want to lie, she said flatly. It's not lying. It's positioning. It's what we do. No, Alexandra said. It's what you do, not anymore. She stood and walked toward the exit, but not before stopping at Carter's row. He looked up at her, his expression neutral, waiting for another insult, another dismissal. I was wrong, Alexandra said. The words felt like they were being pulled from somewhere deep. I judged you. I was cruel, and I'm sorry. Carter's eyes searched her face, looking for the catch, the angle. In his experience, people like Alexandra Reed didn't apologize. They justified. They rationalized. They found ways to make their bad behavior someone else's fault. But she looked genuinely shaken, genuinely ashamed. My daughter was frightened enough tonight, Carter said quietly. I don't need your apology. I need you to not make this into a media circus. Can you do that? Alexandra nodded slowly. I can try. Try hard, Carter said. Because if cameras show up at her school, if reporters start calling her friends' parents, if you use this to make yourself look good at her expense, we're going to have a very different conversation. Understood, Alexandra said. She looked at Bonnie. I'm sorry I was mean to you too. You have a very brave dad. Bonnie pressed closer to Carter, not answering. Kids knew when adults were being fake, but this didn't feel fake. This felt like someone who was genuinely seeing them for the first time. The next 72 hours were a blur. There were official statements, debriefings with the FAA and the airline. Zane, the air marshal, had made his own report, documenting everything that had happened and confirming Carter's credentials and actions. The media descended. But something strange happened. The airline's PR team, under pressure from someone, released a minimal statement. Yes, there had been an emergency. Yes, an additional qualified individual had assisted. No, they would not be releasing passenger names to protect privacy. Someone had made phone calls. Someone had applied pressure in the right places. Someone had used power and influence not to grab spotlight, but to deflect it. Alexandra Reed had kept her word, but she'd done more than that. She'd fired Clinton, not publicly, not dramatically, just quietly removed him from her team and made it clear that his style of leadership was no longer welcome. She'd reached out to her lawyer, Amanda, and together they'd set up something unusual, a fund, anonymous, designed to provide support for single parents facing financial hardship while pursuing education or career changes. She didn't tell anyone, didn't announce it, didn't slap her name on it. She just did it. And she sent something to Bonnie. A package arrived at their apartment a week after the flight. Inside was a model airplane. Not cheap, not plastic. A detailed, beautiful replica of the exact plane they'd been on, and a note, handwritten. Dear Bonnie, your dad is a hero, but I think you already knew that. Thank you for reminding me what real strength looks like. Fly high, Alexandra. Bonnie put it on her shelf, next to the paper airplanes she'd folded with her father. Carter Hayes went back to his quiet life. He didn't want the spotlight, didn't want the attention. He had a daughter to raise, a life to build. The past was the past, and he'd made peace with it. But he'd also made peace with something else. He'd spent years hiding, years pretending he was less than he was, because it felt safer, because it meant protecting Bonnie from questions and judgment and the weight of his history. But that night on the plane, he'd remembered something. You don't protect people by making yourself smaller. You protect them by standing up when it matters. 3 months later, Bonnie came home from school excited. They'd had a career day. Other kids' parents had come in to talk about being doctors and teachers and engineers. "Can you come next time, Daddy?" she asked. "Can you tell them about flying?" Carter hesitated. For years, he would have said no, would have deflected, would have kept that part of himself locked away. But he looked at his daughter's hopeful face and realized something. She wasn't ashamed of him. She was proud. And maybe that was enough. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I can do that." She threw her arms around him, and he held her close. Outside, the world kept spinning. Alexandra Reed was in a board meeting, making decisions that would affect thousands of people. But she was making them differently now, asking different questions, considering different perspectives. Henry, the pilot, had recovered fully and returned to flying. He'd reached out to Carter once, to thank him again. They'd had coffee, talked about old times, about new times, about the strange way life circles back on itself. Finn sent a message too, short, simple. "You saved my career and my life. If you ever need anything, call me." The businessman who'd sat with Bonnie during the landing had changed his morning routine. He now did the breathing exercise Carter had taught. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. It helped with his anxiety, helped him face his days with a little more calm. Small ripples, spreading out from one night when a single father stood up and said, "I can help." Carter tucked Bonnie into bed that night. She was clutching the model airplane Alexandra had sent her, running her fingers along the tiny wings. "Daddy," she said sleepily, "when you helped land the plane, were you scared?" Carter thought about lying, about giving her the hero answer, the one that said he was fearless and strong and never doubted. But he'd learned something about strength. It wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting despite it. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said. "I was terrified. But you did it anyway." "I did it anyway. Because sometimes being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing the right thing anyway." She smiled, her eyes already closing. "I want to be brave like you." "You already are," he whispered. He turned off the light and stood in the doorway, watching her breathe, thinking about choices, about judgment, about the way people see each other. Or fail to. In a penthouse across the city, Alexandra Reed stood at her window, looking out at the lights below. She thought about the man she'd mocked, the man who'd saved her life, the man who'd taught her, without trying. That worth has nothing to do with wardrobe or income or the seat you can afford on a plane. She'd spent her whole life climbing, accumulating, proving, and in one night. A single father in a worn jacket had shown her what actually mattered. Not power, not money, not control. Courage. Kindness. The willingness to stand up when others need you. She picked up her phone and looked at the latest report from the fund she'd established. 12 families helped so far. 12 parents getting a second chance. She'd never meet them. They'd never know her name. And that was exactly right. The city glowed below her, full of people she'd never see, full of stories she'd never know, full of single parents working double shifts and teaching their kids to fold paper airplanes and carrying secrets about who they used to be, full of people who deserved better than her judgment. She turned from the window and went to bed, carrying with her the memory of a pilot's salute, a moment when all her assumptions had shattered like glass, and in a small apartment on the other side of town. Carter Hayes sat on his couch, looking at the old ID card he'd finally shown Bonnie. She'd asked questions. He'd answered them, honestly, gently, age-appropriately. "So you were really important?" she'd asked. "I was good at my job," he'd said. "But the most important thing I ever did was become your dad." She'd hugged him then, and he'd felt something loosen in his chest, a weight he'd been carrying for years, the fear that his past would hurt her, the shame of hiding, the exhaustion of pretending to be less than he was. He put the ID card away, not hidden this time, just stored, part of his history, part of his story, part of the man who'd stood up on a shaking plane and said, "I can land this plane," and meant it. The night had started with contempt and ended with respect, had started with judgment and ended with understanding, had started with a single father being mocked and ended with him being saluted. But more than that, it had ended with a little girl sleeping peacefully, knowing her father would always stand up when it mattered. And that was the only landing that truly counted.